By a vote of 50 to 43, Republicans led the charge to take down consideration of a border security bill on this Thursday. North Dakota Senators Kevin Cramer and John Hoeven voted to kill it. Minnesota Senators Amy Klobuchar and Tina Smith voted to move it forward. So, while just about everyone agrees border security is one of the top issues, a bill that could start fixing some of the problems remains dead. Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut explains it. He was one of those who wrote the bipartisan bill over last fall and winter. That was killed at the direction of Trump.
We went through a painstaking process to negotiate a bipartisan compromise. That process was begun at the request of Senate Republicans. In the room was their appointed negotiator and representatives of their chosen leader of the conference. It couldn't be more official than that. Their appointed negotiator, Senator Lankford, the leader of their caucus, Senator McConnell, in the room for 4 months negotiating a bipartisan border security bill. At the end of that process, we achieved a result. We got an agreement with the people that the Senate Republican caucus told us to get an agreement with. And within 24 hours, almost every Senate Republican had sided against that bill. I submit everybody probably had different reasons for it, but it was very clear that up until the point where Donald Trump said, "Don't do anything, I want the border to be a mess," there were plenty of Senate Republicans that were very invested in that process. Included in that bipartisan compromise are important reforms in the way that we try to make sure that anyone with a violent history never enters the United States. Under current law, if you have a criminal history outside of the United States or a previous criminal history inside of the United States, that doesn't become relevant to your asylum claim until you present before an asylum judge. Under the bipartisan bill, that question of whether you have a violent history and whether you should enter the United States happens at the border as part of your credible fear screening. That would be a really important bipartisan reform to make sure that anybody with a violent history never enters the United States. The current law isn't good enough. The bipartisan bill would have made that law better and made this country safer. But Republicans are going to almost to an individual vote against that later today. And so what we're left with are these unanimous consent agreements that don't come close to providing the kind of security that the bipartisan border bill does. But it also serves a second purpose. It also has a secondary impact. I wish my Republican colleagues didn't care only about crimes committed by immigrants. I know they care about crimes committed by others, but it seems that there's a disproportionate amount of energy on this floor dedicated to crimes committed by immigrants, which gives the impression to the American public that there is a specific problem related to immigrant communities, that they commit crimes at rates that are higher than natural-born Americans, when in fact the opposite is true. I worry that there is an effort afoot to try to turn us against each other, to make us fear immigrants, when in fact immigrants commit crimes at a rate much lower than natural-born Americans. U.S. citizens are over 2 times more likely to be arrested for violent crimes than immigrants are. Immigrants are 60% less likely to be incarcerated in this country than natural-born Americans are. The mass shooter in Las Vegas wasn't an immigrant. The mass shooter at Pulse nightclub wasn't an immigrant. The mass shooter in Sandy Hook wasn't an immigrant. The mass shooter in Uvalde wasn't an immigrant. The mass shooter in El Paso wasn't an immigrant. The mass shooter in Sutherland Springs wasn't an immigrant. The mass shooter in Lewiston, Maine wasn't an immigrant. The mass shooter in Parkland wasn't an immigrant. And yet there wasn't a rush to the floor by my Republican colleagues after those mass shootings to try to fix the problem.